Welcome to today's show. My name is Glenn Diesen. I'm a professor at the University of Southeastern Norway. With me is Alexander Mercouris with the Duran. And with us today is Karin Kneissl, which is none other than the former foreign minister of Austria, also a well-known academic. So let me just say, yes, welcome and thank you much for your time.
You're most welcome. Good afternoon.
So there's a lot to discuss now that we can dig into your expertise on everything from European politics, EU-Russian relations, Europe's relationship with Middle East, the United States. But I thought perhaps a good place to start would be on diplomacy, as you have as a diplomat and having written a book on diplomacy. Because I'm curious where we are at the moment with European diplomacy, because diplomacy largely is about dialogue with the other side, to put yourself in their shoes, to understand their concerns, again, for the purpose of exploring common interest, resolving differences. Now, I don't see much diplomacy anymore in Europe often. So again, the Europeans, previously the champions of diplomacy, it now appears it's been almost replaced, if I'm not mistaken, by some pedagogic role in which we, the Europeans, are the teachers to teach the students around the world, which are our counterparts. So diplomacy often seems to now consist of lecturing other states and even threatening with sanctions. Now, maybe I'm too critical, but again, we'll pass it over to our expert, Karin Kneissl.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Professor Diesen, for the invitation. Well, let me answer the question in a little bit of a chronological and biographical order for myself. When I joined the Austrian Federal Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the late 1980s, diplomacy was, to my assessment, still around in the sense that a Minister of Foreign Affairs would dedicate time to his colleagues, engage in a conversation, listen to, and do trust building. That's what it is all about. And I'm grateful to the period of the late 1980s, early 1990s, when I could, so to say, study the craft of diplomacy, because I always distinguish between craft and art. All art stems from some sort of good, solid craft. And there are some ingredients to the craft of diplomacy. First of all, I would put time, talent that you need. We have a lot of non-talented diplomats in all ministries of foreign affairs. And diplomacy differs from international relations. It doesn't mean when you have a PhD in international relations that by definition you are a superb diplomat, because when I quitted the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I had many reasons, and if I may take one only, it was the absence of intellectual challenge. Now, this might be a bit disturbing for professional diplomats, but there is not so much intellectual challenge when you do the day-to-day diplomacy, which is, in the end, a lot about a patient, discreet approach to sometimes a stalemate, to sometimes a lot of organizing, if you're in consular affairs, organizing visits. And the intellectual challenge is not always that omnipresent like the one that you have as a teacher, as an analyst, as a writer. And when I quit it after 10 years of having served as a junior diplomat, I was very much pleased in what I was doing then, just like teaching and writing and doing research. When I came back as a minister in 2017, I had already started writing a manuscript on diplomacy, and it was, let's say, 60% finished in my drawer. I didn't have the time then to finish it because I was in the midst of preparing for my mission. And it's good that I didn't publish it then, because having come back at the top of the ministry and observing what has happened to diplomacy was quite disturbing. It was already by 2017, I could say, a deep decline in all what you can call the craft of diplomacy. going to the ministerial councils, there was not something I would call a political dialogue. There was no dialogue at all. It was just about reading the lines to take, reading the speaking notes, the talking points. So this has little to do with diplomacy, and what you just mentioned, reading to each other's, lecturing to each other, that had been present already beforehand. And not only on the level EU versus the vast continent of Africa, EU versus EU applicants, whatever. No, we have also had it among EU members. So there was already a deep decline. And when we now jump into the year 2022 and current times, unfortunately, one must say diplomacy is at least in a coma, if not dead, to a certain extent. And it has to be reinvented because we will need it. We will have to do with it. And this art and this art of diplomacy that you need, going beyond the craft in very tough situations, in huge dilemmas, this still exists, and there are still professionals. But in many, many Western ministries of foreign affairs, to the detriment of the legal advisor, it was all about PR and communication. The PR departments have been endowed with tremendous means and importance. The press officer of the pertinent minister is much more important than the legal advisor, than the head of the political department. And this holds true for, I may say, 99% of Western ministries of foreign affairs. It's a bit different when you go to countries like India, Pakistan, China, Russian Federation. I've seen there's still the existence, and Turkey, of course, as well, because Turkey is currently one of the few countries practicing daily diplomacy, where the professionals are still allowed to be part of the daily work. And it's not outsourced to some communication experts.
Mm. Where has this come from? Is this a cultural change, or is it something that has come down from somewhere? I mean, is this something that, as I said, emerged organically, or was it imposed?
No, it has emerged, as I just had tried to describe over the last 30 years when I was speaking of the late 1980s, when I was a junior diplomat, and going back to today. So I just tried to make a tour d'horizon of the last 35 years, and it's a development.
So it's been a progressive decline throughout. And what lies behind it? Is it because I mean, you mentioned IR, because I'm in international relations studies, which I have had some experience of, by the way. I mean, is it because that sort of narrowed our it's an inappropriate training for diplomats, or is it because ideological considerations of other sorts have grown stronger, or is it because it's become more bureaucratic, or is it because we're overconfident in the West of our power, perhaps, and we don't feel that we need to do diplomacy anymore?
I would say, first of all, and this might sound a bit banal, but it's a loss of manners. Good manners. You don't have to have a huge training in diplomacy. Already some good manners would be sufficient to change the current situation. And good manners include hospitality. Good manners include respect for each other and not imposing your view. So there's a huge loss of simply a well-mannered daily approach towards each other, and so this is definitely one topic. And the other thing is that you said that maybe we thought, or whoever thought, that we don't diplomacy, we're not anymore in need of diplomacy. When you go back to the memoirs of Thomas Jefferson, who before turning into one of the first US presidents, he served as ambassador, not really ambassador, he was Gesandter, he was envoy of the young Republic of the United States to London and to Paris. And in his memoirs, you can read his deliberations about what he saw at the courts, especially of the pre-revolutionary France. And he coined already the notion of transformative diplomacy. Now, transformative diplomacy has nothing to do with diplomacy, because diplomacy means mutual respect and non-interference in domestic affairs. The moment you think like Jefferson did, and then all his successors, that you have to tell the host country how to behave, what to do, how to change, how to turn into a homo novus Americanus, that makes a difference. And ever since Jefferson, I would claim this has been the approach of numerous countries. And real diplomacy is non-interference in domestic affairs, well behavior, and you have to have a good mix of discretion, open-mindedness, curiosity, kindness, common sense, as Harold Nicholson stated. You shouldn't be a lawyer, you shouldn't be a religious missionary, but lots of common sense, and this is certainly gone.
Well, yeah,
I don't think anybody would disagree. Go on, Glenn.
Well, a lot of modern diplomacy has much of its origin from the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, and as you pointed out, this is the idea of sovereign equality was quite a key component. But that's why I was wondering as well if something changed after the Cold War with this unipolar order, because it seems it's difficult to have proper diplomacy if you don't have this sovereign equality anymore. And it seems that this is a challenge, I guess, with this ideological place we're in at the moment. Because, again, after the Cold War, there was, I would argue, could have been a good idea that democracy and human rights should have a greater role in the international system instead of focusing on zero-sum competing interests. But on the other hand, it kind of fueled ideological conflicts as well, because now it seems very difficult to have diplomacy when we talk about, if you have the champion of liberalism, which is us, and and diplomacy entails for us the object to educate the subject, or for the teacher to educate the student. You're not supposed to have a two-way. Then it's just one side telling the other one what to do. It's almost like a civilizing mission. So that this is what I don't know, this is what really stands out in the language, I guess, the diplomats use now, because we don't talk about harmonizing our interest with others or discussing the policies of others. We talk about modifying their behavior. As a good teacher, we reward or we punish. But often you see that assumption of unilateral concessions tends to be this tends to be the assumption. So you can never compromise, because a teacher or the champion of democracy don't compromise with the student. Democracy don't compromise with authoritarianism, just like good doesn't compromise with evil. It seems to be this it prevents sovereign equality if one structures the world in this order. Well, I'm not sure if that's the way I see it, but what worked in the 90s, does it still work now? I mean, do you feel the Europeans are having more difficulty with this format for diplomacy as the world becomes more multipolar?
The question is to me. Yeah.
Yes, sorry.
Well, it's all what you have said, I subscribe to it. Ever since the Westphalian peace and the order that we still apply, diplomacy has gone through tremendous changes, but in the end, one should not lament too much and say today's media have overtaken it, because when you go through the history of 19th and early 20th century, you will read quotes, whether it was by Bismarck or others, who said, well, ever since the telegraph has been developed, the phone, this has to say disturbed and put upside down the methods. But there still is something that is the core, the hard core of diplomatic work, which means to remain in dialogue on speaking terms under all circumstances. If you want to break it down to a mathematic formula, this is the one I may give. And this is definitely not the case in the current situation, and it hasn't been the case when we also go back to 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran. The US was ready to work with the regime change, to which they had also contributed to a certain extent, if there hadn't been the hostage taking at the US embassy. And the hostage takers were hesitating whether to go to the US embassy or to the Soviet Union embassy. The world would have changed. The course of history might have changed. But ever since November 1979, there hasn't been any diplomatic contact between Tehran and Washington. Now, this is one case study that you can take in order to expose that it can put you in a very, very special dilemma, and that definitely is the case when it comes to the US in the Middle East and the US towards Iran, to move us away from the current situation, which of course is a much more complex one, the collective West against the Russian Federation.
I mean, it seems to me, Karin, that what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that there's a failure to understand that unless people talk to each other, conflicts can't be resolved. In fact, they might escalate to the point where peace itself breaks down. And I would have thought that the ultimate priority, the overriding priority of a diplomat is, where possible, to preserve peace. That doesn't seem to be something that people understand anymore, at least in the world of diplomacy. Or am I overstating things?
No, of course, whenever you have a conflict that materially breaks out, then you speak of a failure of diplomacy. That's the way it is. I always I never approved of all these attributes that you put in front of the word diplomacy, such as preventive diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, coercive diplomacy, you name it, you have it, because it's at odds with what diplomacy is all about. And diplomacy, by definition, is about preventing conflict. So when you speak of preventive diplomacy, it's nonsense, because diplomacy is that what it is about, and anything else is just what you call in Greek grammar a hendiadjoin. It's a multiplying of adjectives which are needless. So as a U.S. general, Jean-Yves Klein, he was originally from France. He once stated in a very nice conversation I could conduct with him many years ago. He told me, you see, for conflict prevention on a diplomatic level, you never get a medal called for bravery in the field. As a military, you can be rewarded with these kind of medals. You get the publicity, but true diplomacy should be behind closed doors. And this is something that a certain Woodrow Wilson already had problems with. So his slogan, open covenants, openly arrived at, as he was stating when he made his declaration on the 14 points, is something that I also wouldn't approve of, because open covenants, yes, I mean, ever since the League of Nations, we had them registered in the League of Nations Treaty Series, later on in the UN Treaty Series. That's for sure. This is something that is part of the rule of law, but not openly arrived at. You know, when you put the limelight of the media on each and every step, on each and every gesture, there wouldn't never have been something like the Oslo agreements. Speaking to Professor Diesen in Oslo, that was a very courageous act by representatives both of the Israeli government and of PLO officials, who could have risked also to be shot for high treason or end up in prison. But they did it, and that was due to the fact that everybody kept quiet about it, and there was no hourly accompaniment by the media. So these features that you need, apart from talent, good behavior, I come back to the good manners that I consider as preconditional in mutual approach. It also needs it needs discretion. There has to be silence for a certain time until you arrive at something that is ready for signature, ready for ratification.
Well, see, sorry, Alexander.
No, go on, Glenn.
Oh, it just seems as very, the environment has changed a bit. It was just not that long ago a meeting at the ODYSEE, and when the opposing side, Russia's supposed to speak, you see everyone stand up and leave the room. It's very strange. It's a very different environment, not very conducive of diplomacy. But I want to ask more specifically about Austria, because do you see that as having a special brand of diplomacy? I'm thinking more due to its neutral stance. Whenever we read case studies of neutrality, there's always Austria as a key example, something to be emulated. I'm not sure if it's too unique to be emulated, but how do you see this impacting Austrian diplomacy? This neutral scope.
Yeah, well, I was born in 1965, and I'm a pure product of that. We are neutral. We are loved by the rest of the world because we are neutral. We are so kind and tiny. I mean, this was the mindset that we were brought up, not only at school. We discussed it, whether it was in our English classes or French classes. We discussed the importance of Vienna's being a host city to the United Nations, to international organizations, thanks to neutrality. I mean, that's what all the self-perception of Austrian identity has been about for the last 60 years, 70 years, I would say. And to get there was quite a cumbersome way, because in the 1954-55, after the death of Stalin, when negotiations somehow started, because between 45 and 53 there was no negotiation at all about the future status of Austria. It was occupied by the four victorious allies, just like Germany was occupied. And there was also the idea, the possibility of the country being divided up. It could have happened. So when the notion of neutrality was discussed second half of 53, 54, there was a strong reluctance by the then Austrian political class, which was somehow had been fomented partly in prison, partly in the opposition, in the underground, one must say, because many of the first of those who were then back in power had come out of concentration camps. So for them, neutrality was something, how to handle, what to do with it. When it was, when the law on neutrality was passed by Parliament, and it was added in the parliamentarian debate that Austria will conduct a foreign policy of neutrality, permanent and all-encompassing neutrality, guaranteed by the four allies. This is the big difference to the unilateral diplomacy of neutrality of other countries. Along the practice, the example of Switzerland. So Switzerland was the example that people could familiarize with, because Switzerland in the 50s, that was the symbol of prosperity and peace and attraction. And the Austrian foreign minister and later Chancellor Bruno Kreisky was clever enough to understand that there would never be any sort of security guarantee for preserving this neutrality unless certain countries would step in case something would happen. And this made him push in a very systematic foreign policy of attracting international organizations. So he was the first one to recognize, for instance, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, as an international organization, which they had a hard time in convincing in the early 1960s. 1965, OPEC took its headquarters in Vienna, and Austrians were very happy to have that. United Nations, ODYSEE, and many other organizations followed. Coming to the year 2022, I'm quite astonished. I mean, I left my country 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, due to the prohibition to work and due to constant death threats, which continue until today. But I am quite astonished, intrigued by the fact that the government, the federal president, are somehow slicing up neutrality into a political and a military concept. And given that the European Union is now about to buy ammunition in a common way, just like they bought vaccines in a common way, this will produce problems for the Austrian concept of neutrality. And the three neutrals that joined the EU in 1995, Sweden, Finland, and Austria, neutral, not neutral, ever since joined the European Union in 1995, huge debate. And when you take polls today, you will see that the majority, according to the polls, it's something like 70% of the citizens are still in favor of neutrality. You can also consider it as a politics of opportunism, no doubt about that. There's a certain flavor of opportunism in the whole thing. But you have, not for the first time, I remember in the year 2000, we had a similar debate, and now again, there are initiatives asking for an open, fully fledged debate about the security status of Austria, which could end up in an abandoning of neutrality. Now, Austria, in contrast to Finland and Sweden, has a neutrality that is based on an international treaty where other states are signatories. So you just cannot abandon it because you're in a mood.
Mm. Is neutrality, though, I mean, what you're saying is that since joining the European Union, Austrian neutrality has been diluted, which of course begs the question, given the extent to which we talk about the European Union and the North NATO alliance as part of the Euro-Atlantic system, is it really compatible that, with membership of the European Union as it functions today? I mean, I want to make the last point very clear. I can imagine other structures, European structures, but that this very politicized, very radical European Union, which we have now, is it really compatible with the fact that some of its member states, like Austria, might still want to retain some kind of neutral policies? I mean,
well, let me put it the following. When Vienna sent its letter of application to join the European communities, that was in summer 1989. So that was before the legal structure of the European Union with its common foreign and security policy had been established. The negotiations, however, started when there was already an EU. And I, as a teacher of international relations, have always pointed out that it was quite a contradiction. And when I studied international law, if you had responded to the question of the professor, can Austria join the European communities? I'm speaking about the communities and not the European Union of the 1980s. The question had to be no, because the answer would have been no, it's in conflict with the status of permanent neutrality. You see? And the Swiss took it even much more serious. Switzerland joined the United Nations only in 2002 after 2 failed referenda, because a very strict interpretation of neutrality, according to the Swiss, who always were very rigid about their interpretation of diplomacy, said, we cannot follow UN Security Council sanctions, for instance, on a Chapter 7 operation, because that would be in contradiction with neutrality. Even so, Switzerland was a member of specialized organizations such as UNHCR, or International Atomic Energy Agency. But so there was a problem, a truly legal problem from the very beginning, which was interpreted by us, the Austrians, in the way, well, we will go along with the common foreign and security policy, but we will not join any military operation. Because we could only join one according to the Chapter 7 of the United Nations. When I look back at other war situations, namely Kosovo 1999, Iraq 2003, the then governments were very, very strict about transit rights through the territory. When you look into the year 2022, Hungary, as a NATO member, is much stricter, handles transit of weaponry in a much more strict way than neutral Austria. And there were also Hungarian members of government who said, well, we are in a military alliance, but in that case of the Ukraine war, we try to take a neutrality stance. And this also holds true for Turkey. So Austria, under the current conditions, in my humble view, has definitely abandoned many features of its foreign policy along neutral lines, along the example of what Switzerland was in the 1960s, 70s. And I wouldn't say that there's a problem right now with the current European Union. I would say there has been a problem from the very early beginnings, but now it's exploding or imploding, whatever way you take it. And the real litmus test will be now, in my assessment from far away, in this collective purchasing of ammunition.
But it seems like it will transform European diplomacy, because throughout the Cold War, neutrality was a very central component. You had this belt between the West and the East with neutral states, and to a large extent, that's what the Russians demanded in Ukraine as well, to preserve the new dividing line. So Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine, that they have to remain neutral. But not only was that rejected, which we're now also paying a price for, but we also see the traditional neutral states in Europe, be it Austria sending weapons, but also now Finland and Sweden joining NATO. This is quite dramatic. The former NATO secretary Anders Fogh Rasmussen, he said that in the future, if we have a conflict with Russia, it's very important to have Finland and Sweden within, because now we can put a blockade on St. Petersburg. I mean, this transforms how the East and West will operate with each other. Even Norway, we're not neutral. We were founding member of NATO, but we'll join in the beginning. But still, we had the self-imposed restrictions. We wouldn't have foreign troops on our soil, limit the military activity in the far north. But now we're opening American military bases on our soil. This was decided before the Russian invasion, by the way. And, which the Americans in more or less open seas as a way to challenge the Russians in the Arctic. So all of Europe is now transforming. It's just not hard. It's not easy to see how this will be to benefit of stability and security. But again, there's no discussion about neutrality. It's just, do you counter evil? Are you soft on Russia? Are you tough on Russia? This is how we seem to divide, to be the intellectual depth of politics these days. Which kind of wanted to take me to take my point to what you mentioned before, that you were chased out of Austria, because I thought, I consider you a classic diplomat, if you will. So I remember when you got married in 2018, you invited the state leader of the Russian Federation to come to the wedding. There was even a video where you danced with President Putin at the wedding. For me, this is how world leaders should behave to have this openness, even during times of trouble, to keep this diplomatic connections alive. But the political climate doesn't really permit for this anymore, does it? I mean, it's a bit of a leading question given what happened to you, but this was quite a dramatic moment in your career, because I thought this was a great moment in how diplomats should behave, but this was harshly punished in Austria, wasn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, thank you very much that you share with us your approach, that this is how people should behave, and it's a matter of maybe how should I say, that what it always was about, that there is also some sort of interaction on other levels than just at the negotiating table, which doesn't impede anybody from putting your lines or conditions or whatever. But as you correctly pointed out, yes, I was harshly punished for that, and I have to live with it. But this situation is that we have lost all sort of this kind of atmosphere, that there is something beyond that does not belong to the pure hardcore of international relations, of political analysis, of ideological whatever. I mean, you can put all that into books and into courses, but when it comes to a moment of negotiation, you have to gain the trust of the other. You have to put your vis-a-vis at ease. And this is something that is not taught in the classes, that goes beyond what the protocol can do. The protocol can be very helpful on certain issues, but in the end, we are still human beings. We are not yet algorithms. We are not yet avatars that are sitting around the negotiation table. And that's how we can still gain the other, or try to make our position understood by the other. And when you look at big conferences, congresses, it was about the dance, it was about presents that you offer each other, it's about the hospitality, food that you offer, the time that you dedicate to each other, and all that is part of also what we have to call international relations, because human beings relate to each other.
One would have thought that in Austria, of all places, people would understand that best. I mean, I've never been a diplomat, but I've studied the Congress of Vienna, and of course they all argued and quarreled and had disputes about Poland and all kinds of other things, but they all went off and had their balls afterwards, and it actually helped the process of diplomacy along, and they delivered a European peace, which survived many decades. Do people in Austria, I wonder, understand how important and beneficial for Austria's international standing its neutrality has been? And do people in Europe, and I'm talking about now, the whole of Europe, understand, again, how enormously helpful, beneficial it has been for Europe altogether, that there have been countries like Austria which have been able to play diplomatic roles because they're neutral states. They're able to talk to everybody. They're able to talk to the Arab countries. You mentioned OPEC. Not that OPEC is just confined to Arab countries, but also to the East Asians, to the Russians. If you go to Vienna, which I have been, you sense this, that it's the center. It's one of those places that is at the center of things, and that the world converges there. And I would have thought this has been enormously helpful and useful to Europe. as the world changes and becomes more complex with all kinds of great powers, that are non-European, appearing on the scenes, the Chinese, the Indians, the Brazilians, the others.
Yes, well, thank you very much for reminding us and the audience of Vienna Congress. Yes, it was the balls, it was the dinners and the corridor talks that we have today, also at the United Nations and other international organizations. Then we had other types of corridors, longer talks, more time dedicated to each other. But that what it was all about, and that you also had at other big occasions. And let me add one important thing to the Vienna Congress. When you compare Vienna Congress to the Paris treaties of 1919, at Vienna Congress, the defeated, which were the French, represented by tremendous Charles de Talleyrand, they were treated on equal levels. So we are back to what Professor Diesen started in the beginning, the equality of sovereignties, equality of sovereigns. And that was not anymore the case in 1919, where, many of the delegations, whether by the Hungarians or the Ottomans or whoever, they had to stand outside in Trianon, Saint-Germain, Versailles, and waiting for the deliberations of the others. So they were not anymore involved in discussing and negotiating that territorial future. And that was still the case in Vienna in 1814, 1815, even so that the real serious work was done later on in Ljubljana, in today's Slovenia, and in Aachen, in Aix-la-Chapelle. But what you were kind of describing about Vienna and this genius loci, this geography, that it's the place where you can talk to everybody. It's a similar feeling maybe you can grasp in Geneva. It's a similar feeling that maybe you can grasp also in Istanbul. But I would say that with the recent attitude, the statements, the taking of sides by Austria as an EU member, but also by Switzerland, has given tremendous harm to both cities as meeting grounds. Both cities played a tremendous role in the Iran negotiations. There were rotations between Geneva and Vienna. Actually, on a footnote, the reason we have for this rotation was a very banal, very simple one. It was about hotel reservations because you needed, so to say, the hotel meeting grounds, and they were not always available. So the rotation was a very technical one. But Vienna, Geneva, Lausanne played a role in 2013, 14, 15, especially to host these talks between the US and Iran, which were interesting enough. I think it was Minister Lavrov, foreign Russian minister, who said already sometimes last summer that both Switzerland and Austria have lost their role as mediators, facilitators even. We are not speaking about mediation, we're speaking about offering the hotel, the meeting ground, being the facilitator, given to their stances. And that goes beyond now joining sanction regimes. It goes beyond the fact that there was a lot of confiscation, freezing in legally doubtful circumstances. So where are the meeting grounds? I would say that future meeting grounds might be maybe in Budapest, might be New Delhi, might be Istanbul. Because for the reasons we discussed beforehand, and it's all about trust. Where do you go to? Where do you feel as a delegation at ease, and where you're not risking to be attacked? So these are maybe cities which are not anymore in Vienna or in Geneva, but somewhere else.
But this, of course, displaces diplomacy the centre of diplomacy away from the European Union, the core of the European Union, because Austria is at the core of Europe. If you're in Austria, if you're in Vienna, you sense how much it is at the core of Europe. It displaces it because in Budapest is not quite as central as Vienna is. And of course, Istanbul, well, it's not even in the EU, and New Delhi is far away. So, it diminishes. It's part of the diminishing of Europe's role, which I think is something that Europeans perhaps don't understand. The more, at least this is how I think, the more centralized we become, the more we follow rigidly one set of policies, which we are altogether following, in a strange kind of way, our influence declines because people, they're not dealing with us in the way that they once did as a sort of storied, complex society where they could integrate and talk to the Germans and talk to the French and base themselves in Vienna and negotiate and come to deals. And they're now dealing with a single entity, which is perhaps not one that they want to engage with in that kind of way anymore, especially if its caliber of diplomacy, its quality of diplomacy has fallen in the way that you discussed at the very start of this program.
Yeah. Well, when we remember the first speech by Commission President Ursula von der Leyen in December 2019, when she announced that this will be a geopolitical commission, I was wondering how that notion of a geopolitical commission could be reconciled with how the EU had been defining itself throughout the decades, which was not about power politics, which was about harmony and consensus and watered down resolutions and trying to do some sort of tightrope walk where everybody could live with. And then there was this opening speech echoed by Josep Borrell saying it will be about tough language and everything. And 2 years later, we saw the results. Geopolitics, which is about power politics, for that, if I may say, you need a group of good geographers, a group of good historians, people who have really studied that. And yes, there has been a geopolitical tradition in France and in the UK, which took it over to a certain extent also from the Germans, who were the fathers, not the mothers, but mostly the fathers of the early days of geopolitics. Plus, there were also some Swedish, I think there was anyway, we have many minds behind the early days of geopolitics. But if you're very honest about what the European Union always wanted to be, you can't be geopolitical, in my eyes. And now we have gone a step much more beyond that. Going back to Josep Borrell, the High Representative, the chief diplomat, who uses everything but the diplomatic language. We all remember his statement of April last year when he said very clearly that war will be decided on the battlefield and not at the negotiating table. So they have all prejudiced themselves and they have all taken themselves out of future negotiations. Plus, the quote by Mrs. Angela Merkel, former German Chancellor, who said in December in 2 interviews that the Minsk negotiations in summer 2014 were all about gaining time for Ukraine. And that was discussed in depth in Russia, but not at all discussed in the European Union. Nobody spoke about it. Nobody wrote about it. Now, I'm in full agreement that at certain instances in a difficult matter, you need to gain time. So you do some sort of freezing, you do some sort of conflict management in order to get time to take out the tension of a difficult topic. But it shouldn't be to the advantage of one and to the detriment of the other. It should have nothing to do with gaining time to buy arms or to redevelop security forces. It should be about something else. Anyway, with that, and here I may quote former German Minister of Economy and former Commissioner Günther Verheugen, who said a few weeks ago in a German interview, such a statement has destroyed all future German or French diplomatic role. So here we are. I mean, anybody who is honest about it has to say there is no diplomatic role for the main capitals of the European Union, and there is no role for the remaining neutrals, because we have taken ourselves out of any facilitating or mediating role.
I don't want to just press on, but just to quickly say, is it surprising, in light of what you've just said, that we now have a war in Europe? Because if there's no diplomacy, if there's no kind of discussion or negotiation, and there's no conflict resolution, I mean, that inexorably leads to war, or so it seems to me.
Yeah, it leads to war. And what I consider as so dramatic, it's not only about war between the officials, if you want, because you always could say, well, it's the governments who are at odds with each other. By the way, also soldiers don't go to war against each other. It's the politicians who ask this, or who give the directive to the armies to go to war. So soldiers, by definition, are not the ones who start wars. But what we have today, and I, if you want, I'm a tiny, unimportant collateral damage of all that. There is a volume of polarization and hatred in many European societies, not in all of them. I lived in France for a while when I quitted Austria. And when I was in France and I said, I'm going to Moscow next week to give my courses, that was before the war, people would say, oh, how interesting, wonderful place. I always wanted to go there. I have read Tolstoy. This is the French approach. It's all about literature. When I would say the same thing in Austria or Germany, there was this historical antagonism, even though the Germans and the Austrians profited very much from Russian money. But the atmosphere is a different one. And this degree of polarization, deep rift, this canceling of Russian culture that we have now, this prohibition of Russian media, all that we didn't have in the Cold War, we didn't have in previous wars. We are stuck in some very archaic drama, and I cannot think of any EU political figure that would be in a position to open this Gordian knot that is there. And when Viktor Orban calls for ceasefire and so on, I mean, he's right. The ceasefire is the first step. We are not yet speaking about diplomacy, just the ceasefire, so that people are not anymore killed. He's the only one. Nobody on the other side, including the Austrians, nobody among the Austrian politicians so far has asked for a true ceasefire.
Well, I was curious about. Actually, you have a background in energy. I was wondering what would be the economic consequence of this, because we already discussed the Europe no longer being a center of diplomacy. As well, there's no one is neutral anymore. We also have obviously the huge problem now that. Both the French, the Germans, the UK, and the US are all admitted to some extent that Minsk agreement, the peace agreement for 7 years, were seen as an attempt to arm Ukraine instead, which you correctly pointed out. By arming them, you also prevented the diplomacy, because part of the purpose was that they wouldn't have to implement the Minsk agreement by arming instead. But now. We also have the issue of the free press, again, censoring media, this removing this liberal veil of Russophobia by effectively opening up for collective punishment. That we're going after Russian sports figures, athletes, artists. It seems to be a completely new chapter. But I was curious more about the economic side, because Europe has also taken some very unprecedented steps in this manner. I'm thinking then of not just freezing Russian money of the central bank, but actually stealing it now as well, saying that they will confiscate it. And in order to make it legal, they will find laws, they will develop laws to make it legal, which is a strange take on what the law is supposed to be. But also we see individuals in Russia, they've had their assets seized because they were accused of having ties with Kremlin. Again, no day in court, no due process. So I'm just, for us in the West, we often interpret this as virtue, that look all the steps we're taking. But in the rest of the world, many people are seeing this as a very aggressive step, that we have now abandoned the rule of law. So of course this is one aspect, but also the energy. I mean, we talked for so many years about Russia maybe using energy as a weapon, but now we cut ourselves off Russian energy. What will be the consequence of this? Because Germany, of course, the economic leader of Europe, and its heavy industries are very energy intensive, relying on Russia. And now Austria, of course, this economy very closely linked to Germany. How is Europe supposed to recover from this? Or sorry, this is your area of expertise. So how is this going to play out?
Well, to put it in a nutshell, the Wirtschaftswunder of the 1990s and the last 20 years were built on two factors. One was the relatively cheap, let's say affordable Russian energy. It's not, no energy is cheap, because there's also, as we just have been speaking, the political price to it. But let's say it was an affordable energy and reliable, no doubt, on one thing. And the other thing is the Chinese market. I mean, without that, the German automotive industry would have never flourished the way it has been flourishing. And when you increase the energy price by 40%, and that's the case when you import liquefied natural gas from North America instead of natural gas from Russia, even without all the volatility on the global markets, you already increase by 40% because it's more expensive. And the refining is more complex. Plus, you have maybe competitors in Asia who are ready to buy that or that LNG vessel at short notice because they paid a better price. So it's volatile. And this carries the risk of factories turning into museums in Germany now. I mean, this has been the case already for the last 20, 30 years, because we were outsourcing textile industry first, then steel industry. Later on, we outsourced also medical supply, pharmacology, medicament producing, and so on, which we realized during the pandemic it was not such a clever thing. So we are in the midst of deglobalization, which started some time ago. The French developed already 15 years ago the notion of demondialisation, deglobalization, and it's an accepted term in France of the last 15 years. And we are entering an age where things will be more expensive. By the way, also Chancellor Scholz said that already last year, that the times of cheap products is over. But that will have a tremendous impact on also how the EU as a whole, as an entity, will continue to function, if it functions, because Germany could only be the engine, the one that said, let us do a euro saving mechanism, the ESM of 2009-10, when the euro was at risk because of the Greek crisis, because the automotive industry made Germany so strong. The automotive industry stands for 55% of this net exporting power of this world champion, with its many hidden champions, the small and medium-sized family businesses, which are part of the supply chain for the automotive industry or for the petrochemical industry. So Germany will change, and this will have an impact in terms of decision-making inside the European Union, because of course the 27 don't decide on the equality of the sovereigns. It's Germany, Paris, it's Berlin, Paris, plus the one or the other big capital on certain instances. But the energy embargo that this time, and to my knowledge for the first time in history, was declared by the customers, by the demand side, and not by the suppliers, as we had the oil crisis in the 70s, the OPEC oil embargo. The suppliers cut the supply, and that had an impact on the demand side. So it's a very weird situation, and I always claim oil, gas also to a certain extent thanks to LNG, but especially oil, it's the global commodity par excellence. Oil will always find its way. Ever since oil entered world history after World War I, Winston Churchill had understood its importance by changing the British Navy from coal to diesel. And it has been fomenting globalization, especially in the 60s, 70s, with container ships, and then the liberalization of the financial markets, as we know. So all that is part of globalization, and oil will find its way. It's finding its way through the so-called shadow fleet that had been established by the Russian authorities to a certain extent, I assume, and Russian companies, finding the vessels which are ready to work with Russia, despite the oil price cap decision, which is all about insurances, which is all about trying to put an artificial limit on the oil price and saying whoever wants to sell or buy beyond that price will not be insured and will have risks. Now, we are seeing in the global trading that not only oil started to be traded in currencies going beyond the dollar, but we might also see, this is my reading of the situation, insurance companies being created or which are already there. We don't know them as much as we know Allianz and Swiss Re and the big reinsurers. But we will see also the emergence of new, not only financial mechanisms, financial institutions, but also insurance institutions, which are also financial institutions. So a lot is changing, and I don't see the European Union being thereby on the winning side, and definitely not nature or climate being on the winning side, because what is happening now, whether it's the UK, whether it's Germany, King Coal is back. It's coal-fired power plants that are now in number one electricity producers in the UK. The emissions of CO2 were never as heavy in Germany as they are right now, thanks to all the coal-fired plants and the oil-fired plants. So I would say there are lots of losers.
Yeah, that's I liked what you said about the oil. Kind of where it flows is you can see an indication of where globalization is going, because India, its imports of Russian oil used to be non-existent. In November of last year, now Russia became the main exporter of crude oil to India. The leading exporter there, and with it, of course, they have to find solutions to new shipping, new insurance systems, and they're working together to put this all in place. So after this conflict is over, I think there's many people who assume that Europe will be able to scale back sanctions, and we'll go back to the way things were. But there seems to be a new geoeconomic infrastructure coming into place, So again, the diplomacy won't be in Europe. The insurances won't necessarily all be from Europe. The oil won't go to Europe, and the banks they don't want to use the euros now. The Russians and others are also shifting to their own currency. There seems to be a huge shift undergoing, but there's very little discussion I find about this. It's some of the media is picking up on de-dollarization, that other countries are now using more and more of their own currencies, but this assumption that one can use this tool of sanctions in perpetuity without damaging one's own position, it's quite strange. But maybe it's built into the poor diplomacy. But I was wondering though, how did you see any diplomatic solution to this at all, or because I'm looking at, I'm not sure what your take on Nord Stream is. I mean, this is the pipeline obviously exploded. The Americans and Europeans suggest it was the Russians. However, now they're saying that the American intelligence services, according to New York Times, are saying that no, actually it was the Ukrainians or Ukrainian group. I guess the story that it was the Russians became a bit too silly for people to believe, so they're throwing I have a hard time believing it was the Ukrainians. So it looks like they're throwing the Ukrainians under the bus here. I'm just did you see any diplomatic solution to any of this? Because I'm a bit surprised there's no protests from Germany or any of the Europeans. Not a protest. There's hardly any interest at all. Is it just going to go down a memory hole, or where is this going?
Well, the Nord Stream topic, I've been following it ever since 2005, when the then German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder and Russian President Vladimir Putin decided on it in a political way, let's put it like that. And there was so much demand from the German side that in 2016, a new consortium was created to enlarge an existing pipeline. And I always tried to explain to audiences, but also to my counterparts when I was minister, because Nord Stream came up in many, many talks. And they always had their talking points, just their talking points. I could go beyond the talking points because it's my topic. And I always tried to explain Nord Stream 2 is just the enlargement of an existing pipeline, because it was presented to the rest of the world as if for the first time ever, Russia would supply oil in that case, gas in that case, in a direct way by circumventing transit countries, which was not the case. In 2005, we already had the political decision on that. Merkel always said, well, this is a commercial project, this is not political, which is, and the inverted comma, true to a certain extent, because for the enlargement, there was not anymore this big political cloud like for the first pipeline. But of course, such pipelines are always political to a certain extent. Any pipeline is always political. Baku, Tbilisi, Ceyhan in the early 2000s by BP, always political to a certain extent. So the rising protest against Nord Stream 2 was there. And I was pretty sure, I also said it in public in 2018, that I believe that the United States would make the utmost happen so that Nord Stream, once finished in its construction, and there were lots of obstacles put on the way by the US, even once finished, it would be prohibited to make it operative, because I could feel the opposition. But I would have never ever expected that they would sabotage it, that there would be a fully fledged physical attack against an energy infrastructure. So that they would do the utmost to make it operative, that for sure. And we could see it all the way since 2019 with the different obstacles. Then the German certifying technical authority, which had to give, so to say, its administrative blessing, was also lagging behind the time schedule. And then the war started, but with President Biden 6 weeks before the official outbreak and before the start of the invasion, said we will make sure that in case of invasion, Nord Stream 2 would not work. So the fact that the Germans remain so indifferent to what has happened, that countries that are along the littoral countries along the Baltic Sea, whether it's Sweden, I'm thinking especially of Sweden, because I think it was in their limit of territorial water that the explosion happened. No protest by ecologists, no protest by government officials, and to do now this blame game is childish. That's the only answer that I have, because why can't somebody assume the responsibility and say, well, for these and those reasons, we did it? I mean, we are in very weird times, but it's also in weird times you could assume responsibility. And the thing with the passports, I mean, it struck me most that on this, was it a sailing boat? They found passports, and these passports were Ukrainians. I mean, it's you really must take the audience for very, very stupid. It's complete disrespect for the TV listener, for the newspaper reader, in the case of the New York Times. That's all what I can say, but I'm still supposed to write a comment, to finish a comment today on that very thing. Maybe when I have finished my piece, I'm a little bit, I'm in a better position to give a constructive answer. But for me, it's a very childish blame game. And you said, you asked the question, is the US throwing Ukraine under the bus? Some even were speculating, well, this is the beginning of the end. They want to get rid of a fully fledged support. Question mark. I don't know, but it's just a reflection of teenagers in power, as I always say. When you want to meet adults, you have to go east of Vienna, not west of Vienna, to use the ODYSEE terminology.
Extraordinary, strange events that we are living through. I mean, Germany undermining its own economic future. European states unable to conduct diplomacy when they invented it, and perhaps to some extent marginalizing themselves. And of course, a massive deterioration, as you know, to your cost, not just in basic manners, but in due process and the rule of law across Europe, which is, of course, the region of the world that invented those very things, and which were the base of our civilization. We're going to get out of this mess. We need to start talking to each other, not just with our opponents, but with ourselves, and start being honest with ourselves about where we are and where we're going. And coming back to what you were saying earlier in the program, Karin, if we're going to conduct that discussion sensibly, we also need to learn good manners with each other, because no discussion can ever happen unless there's some respect and some courtesy extended to the other person, or so it seems to me. That's not a question, that's perhaps a set of observations, if I can put it like that.
Well, perhaps that's why we need the Austrians, I was thinking, because we talked before about the Vienna Congress and now the Congress of Vienna, because again, this was, one of the most, as you pointed out as well, one of the significant thing is after the French had been beaten, they were included into this organization, became the key security institution of Europe. Now, obviously, after World War I, when Germany wasn't brought in, this created problems. But also after the Cold War, we have to keep in mind that for a short period of time, it looked like we did have a system based on the Congress of Vienna, because we did establish the Charter of Paris for a New Europe in 1990. I mean, the key principles, which Karin referred to, the sovereign equality, it was specified in this document, as well as indivisible security, no dividing lines. This was, again, the foundation for the establishment of the ODYSEE in 1994. I think by abandoning this, by creating perhaps a Europe where, for example, Russia doesn't belong. I think one of the costs has been, which one isn't allowed to discuss these days because everything is good versus evil, is that we don't have sovereign equality today. We're one side that can interfere in domestic affairs, one side that can invade, while the other side cannot. We also have dividing lines. We no longer have indivisible security. So I think, these are things that we would have to come back to if we'd want to not just restore diplomacy, but having some stability again in Europe. Because for me, this system was set up after the Cold War. Now, for me, it seemed to break down in February of 2021. This was when Josep Borrell went to Moscow, same time as when the Americans and the Chinese met in Alaska, and it was quite extraordinary because he came there to lecture the Russians and tell them what to do, and otherwise they would get punished. And this was supposed to be a reset. And same as the Americans meeting the Chinese, just having a long list of all the horrible things they are and what they have done, and this very condescending, us the lecturing, teaching you how to do your affairs. At no point meeting of equals or any compromise intended. So I think we're stepping into a new world where you really need skilled diplomats if you're going to have just this multipolar world where we can't just dictate to others anymore. But I'm not sure where we're supposed to look for this. Even now in this peace agreement, the absence of peace agreements, the only one that's come out is really China, isn't it? So, which I guess would be my last question to Karin. Do you think this would be? Do you think China could be a possible path out of this war now indirect war between NATO and Russia through Ukraine?
Well, it was interesting that Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky reacted, let's say, in a rather interested way. He said, well, let's have a look at it, let's read it, and this is already an important thing. The Russians opened up their ears, they didn't condemn it, and that's what it is all about. The fact that Mrs. von der Leyen and Mr. Borrell and President Biden said, well, the Chinese can never be mediators or offer something because they are too close to Russia. I mean, this is just this complete rebuffing of these 12 points was not very clever, was not at all diplomatic, and it was stupid. Because also some EU officials said, well, this is not a plan, this is just 12 points. Yes, of course. I mean, you cannot impose a peace plan. You can offer certain points, principles. Within these principles, you have territorial integrity. I mean, this is something in favor of Ukraine. You have the lifting of sanctions. This is something in favor of Russia. So it's a give and take. And this will have to be negotiated by the main parties to the war, and not to be imposed by the Chinese or by anybody. But I think that maybe in Beijing there is some sort of deliberation also that there's now a new chapter. A completely new chapter in old dealings. And when I follow the recent statements by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the People's Republic, it's like much clearer wording than we heard before. Mm. And that's that gives way to a new chapter. Maybe in a year from today, people will look back and say, well, we missed an opportunity by not discussing the Chinese 12 points, maybe. But I think the way it was rebuffed by Washington and Brussels was just embarrassing and stupid, and we still regret it because the costs are going up, and it's not only commercial costs, political costs, human costs, and the Chinese have the clout to do it, because we also have to think about. Sorry, my dog is barking. We also have to think about the political phase after the military phase. There will have to be some sort of reconciliation, some sort of investment, and the Chinese are very present in that part of Central Eastern Europe in terms of manufacturing, in terms of agricultural interests. Ukraine is a huge pole of attraction for agricultural investments. China is also part of that. So I would only say it's deplorable that this opportunity is missed. We will see whether it will come up again, but for the time being, we will see more military advances, and I can simply hope that it will not get out of complete control with regards to ABC weaponry.
Yeah, but is it just poor diplomacy, or do we want peace? Because I'm reminded of this German general or retired general Harald Kujat, who was also a chief of the NATO council. I forgot the specific name, but he said that during that when the Russians invaded, they attempted to find a push through a diplomatic solution with Kiev, and they were both close to it, but then it was sabotaged, he said, by the British. This is similar to what you discussed before as well, with the Israeli Prime Minister Bennett saying that the West blocked his negotiation efforts because they wanted to smash Putin, in his words, or with the foreign minister of Turkey, who said also the West blocked his efforts of negotiating peace because, they wanted to weaken Russia. So I'm just thinking this. Of course, that's a year ago since those negotiation attempts were blocked, but only last week it was this retired general or current general in the U.S. Army, Keith Kellogg, who he made a statement a week ago that he called it the acme of professionalism to fight Russia with Ukrainians, because the United States could knock off a key rival without using its own troops, and it could instead focus on China. So I'm not saying that this represents all of the American, all the collective Western view, but there seems to be, this is also a view that's been taken by Senator Lindsey Graham, Dan Crenshaw, Mitch McConnell, that, this is an opportunity. We now have a situation where we can really, if not just weaken, even knock out the Russians without using our own troops. Is this a huge factor in pushing back against diplomatic solutions, or do you see... is it just poor diplomacy, or is it just not readiness for peace?
Well, you see, all the statements you just quoted, and which are important to be remembered, at least for the sake of history, it reminds me a lot of an analogy, if I may draw it, with the 11 years of war in Syria, which I've been following very closely. You cannot compare it one-to-one. Syria is completely different regional conflict. Here we have to do with a truly global conflict in the case Ukraine-Russia. But for 10, 11 years, we have been hearing the statement, Assad must go. And only with a post-Assad government, there would be some sort of talks. And in 2013, the Russian diplomacy had some sort, if I may say, of honorable compromise ready for Damascus and some opposition forces. That was before the emergence of the Islamic State. It was in spring 2013. That proposal was completely rebuffed then also by the European Union, especially by the French. The French said in 2013, Assad will be defeated on the military battlefield. Assad is still there. Assad is coming back into the Middle Eastern Arab world and so on. And it's not an analogy that is helpful for the current situation, but I'm just wondering, did nobody learn out of that? Because many officials inside the European Commission, inside various ministries, national ministries, are still around. We are not speaking of now any sort of analogy which goes back to the 60s or 80s. No, we are speaking of now, of the last 10 years in Syria. And people make exactly the same mistake. Putin must go, Putin must be tried according to international penal legislation, and. I mean, this is the language that is used. If you constantly use that language, how do you want to discuss also other topics, So the French in particular, but also many other EU officials and Washington made tremendous wrong assessments about Syria, and they are doing once again a tremendously wrong assessment about Russia.
Well, on that depressing note, I'm not sure if you'll finish or if you have a final question, Alexander. Oh, sorry, you're muted. Oh, sorry, still muted. Okay. Well, anyways, we'll I guess we'll wrap it up by then. But I just wanted to finish off by thanking you so much, Karin, for taking the time for this, and also thanking on behalf of Alexander, who is muted. So thanks again. We really appreciate this, and best of luck with your work in Lebanon.
Thank you very much, Professor Diesen. Thank you. Alexander Mercouris, and I'm grateful for your interest, and it was a very pleasant, open-ended conversation, the way it should be, taking time for each other and listening to each other. When you have 20-minute meetings between EU officials and other officials at the margins of wherever, that's not diplomacy. This is just putting it into your list of meetings you had for the annual report of the ministry, and I'm grateful also for your for the atmosphere that you created for our conversation, which is rare in these days. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. I hope to have you on some other time then. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Professor Diesen.